Marco Polo, His Travels and Adventures, Chapter 4, Part 2. From Balkh, Marco and his fellow travelers rapidly approached those lofty ranges of gigantic mountains which rise in eastern Turkestan, and which divide Western Asia from China on one side and Hindustan on the other. As he gazed at these eminences, the peaks of which seemed to cleave the very clouds, Marco was deeply impressed by their rugged grandeur. He had never seen or imagined mountains so high, and he wondered how it could be possible for the party to cross them. Sometimes at the end of a valley they seemed to close in the way completely. There seemed to be no possible exit, no declivity or pass seemed to open itself between them. Yet when the travelers reached the foot of the mountains, a narrow defile would be revealed, and they would pass through in single file, leading their horses and camels, sometimes on a path so narrow and so high above the gorge by whose side it ran, that it seemed inevitable that the travelers would fall and break their necks. All through these mountains Marco observed that the people were fierce and wild, and lived wandering lives, subsisting on the game they secured by hunting. They were, for the most part, intemperate, and after a hunt would resort to the nearest village and intoxicate themselves with the fiery palm wine which was everywhere made and drunk in that region. In some places, where sheep were raised on the steep hillsides, Marco found that the shepherds lived in caves in the mountains, so dug as to form dwellings with several rooms. Sometimes these caves were very handsomely fitted up. The next great town that the travelers reached after leaving Balkh was Badakhshan, still famous in our own day as a center of Oriental trade. It was then ruled over by a powerful king who claimed to be a direct descendant of Alexander the Great and of King Darius. The city was situated in the midst of lofty and jagged eminences, and all around, perched on the tops of high crags, Marco espied to the strong castles and fortresses which defended it from hostile attacks. Every pass was thus stoutly guarded, and Marco saw that the people were warlike in their tastes, being excellent archers and very skillful hunters. The men wore the skins of beasts, and the women always clothed themselves in an immense quantity of bombazine, wrapped in many folds around their bodies. On Marco's asking why they did this, he was told that it was because they wished to appear very fat, for this, in the eyes of the men, was regarded as a point of beauty. The women's heads were covered with hoods, while from their ears long sleeves hung to the ground, and swayed to and fro as the stout-looking damsels waddled along. While the wanderers were staying at Badakhshan, for having been made welcome by the king, they were in no great haste to depart. Marco fell extremely ill with a fever. For a while his life was despaired of, but the skill of the native doctors at last set him on his feet again. As soon as he was able to stir abroad, the doctors told him to go to the summit of one of the neighboring mountains and stay a while. This he did, and the air was so pure and dry at that elevation that he very rapidly recovered. Leaving Badakhshan, where the Venetians had much enjoyed their rest and the hospitality of the monarch, they soon found themselves passing along the banks of a wide and swift river, the same that we now know as the Oxus, which, at the point that they reached it, issued from a vast lake, fed by the eternal snows of the surrounding eminences. The river flowed in a vast and most picturesque valley between two lofty ranges, and Marco was fairly transported by the exceeding grandeur of the river. Ascending then to the plateau beyond, the travelers found themselves on a higher level than they had ever before reached, where the atmosphere was so rare that they actually found it difficult to breathe. This was no other than the famous Pamir Steppe, which extends in a broad tableland for many miles between Turkestan and Chinese Tartary. The views from this high altitude were imposing in the extreme. In the distance rose the snowy summits of the Himalayas, while far below the travelers lay the sunny and luxuriant valleys, creeping far under the mountain shadows, in some of which was the birthplace of that great Aryan tribe from which almost every European nation has descended. Many were the interesting sights that Marco saw, as the party slowly wended its way over the mighty steep. There were sheep with horns 3 or 4 feet long, out of which horns the shepherds made knives and spoons. Every little while, along the road, Marco saw piles of these horns heaped up and learned that they were landmarks to guide the traveler on his way when the snows of winter concealed the road from view. Marco was surprised to see no villages or even huts on the great steep, and found that the shepherds, who were its only inhabitants, dwelt in the mountain caves. Descending at last from the Palmyre steep, the party entered what was then the noble and flourishing city of Samarcand. This place was not many years after to be taken by the famous Tartar warrior Timur Tamerlan, and to be made the seat of his splendid empire in Central Asia. And in our own day, the visitor to Samarcand is taken to a mosque where, he is told, repose Timur's remains. Marco was greatly impressed with the wealth and splendor of the city, its imposing temples and palaces, and its bustling bazaars, but time was passing, and the travelers were forced to hurry away and continue their journey eastward. Beyond Samarcand, they proceeded through fruitful valleys and delightful scenes, across fields where the cotton plant was growing luxuriantly, by orchards and vineyards, and through villages where cloths of many kinds were being made. They came to spots where they saw the people searching among the rocks and in the mountain sides for rare jewels, and Marco saw the men extracting rubies, jasper, and chalcedony from the hiding places where nature had concealed them. So traveling, they came at last to a town on the banks of a lake called Lop. This town stood on the borders of the great Gobi Desert, which now alone separated the Polos from the western confines of China. And before entering upon the long tramp across this dreary waste, they resolved to stay at Lop a week and rest. Meanwhile, they made ample preparations for crossing the great desert. It would take them a month, they were told, to gain the other side, and they therefore packed enough provisions to last them that length of time. Happily, there was no need that they should burden themselves with water, for the desert, arid as it was, provided streams that ran from the lofty ranges nearby, in sufficient abundance to supply all who crossed its wide expanse.